Hi, welcome back. Thanks for rejoining this video. In this section, I want to very briefly probably just remind most of you about how we understand the causes of health. And so I just want to spend a few minutes reviewing information that I trust many of you know, and if you don't, maybe this will be new, but I suspect everyone has at least an intuition about this. So the first question we want to ask is, what really causes disease? And I think in America currently, a lot of people think what causes disease is a lack of health care. And I'd just like you to think about that for a minute. It's really not true. It's like saying the reason I have a headache is because I don't have any aspirin. It doesn't work that way, right? You might get a headache and then it might persist because you don't have an aspirin or something related. But the cause of the headache is not the absence of an aspirin. The cause of a headache might be dehydration or working too hard or watching too many IRL videos. So we want to think what the real cause of disease is. It's usually some infection, some trauma, and for many of the diseases of the modern era, sort of social influences. Let's go back to a little history. Historically, and by the way, not so long ago, like 1850, people would debate what the causes of disease are. And for the longest time, of course, people thought God or some higher power caused disease. And then at about 1850, germ theory came to the fore. And people thought that, those who were buying germ theory, that germs caused every kind of disease. We know that's not true anymore. And then around the 1970s, give or take, people really fixated in a market framework that individual choice and behavior causes disease. And finally, more recently, we've begun to appreciate, with the help of social science, that it's really social forces that is driving the things that cause mostly chronic diseases, some acute conditions, and even some infectious diseases. These social forces might be markets and market failures, social norms to smoke cigarettes or not, or to wear a seatbelt or not, clearly discrimination and racism and classism in various forms, preventing people from having access to resources, obviously policies all tied up in that, and then sometimes government failures. Government failures is not just a failure of the government to do something, but someone in the government doing something negative. So this kind of framework of thinking about what causes disease can be viewed from all different perspectives. And I think that's an idea I'd like to really drive home for us, that it's perspective, it's the way we think about it that shows us what we might want to research. So if we sort of take the same idea and make it into a linear framework, we can talk about the cause of causes. And when you see that big arrow up there, it's sort of the causes of disease. On my right-hand side, there's the D for disease. So we might think of it as market forces and norms and racism and sexism set people up to make choices, lifestyles. And so their behavior is not just behavior in a vacuum, but a behavior in a social context for all its good and its bad. And then of course these behaviors, whether you're eating something, whether you're smoking something, whatever it might be, affects your physiology. And then molecular biology, genetics, and even germs, microbes come into the fray. And ultimately, these might be causing disease. So if you ask what causes disease, the answer is all of it. Social forces cause disease and germs cause disease. Where do you want to focus is the question. That is, there's multiple causes, if you will, upstream and downstream. And so we can talk about these as immediate or proximal causes. Maybe it's that you're exposed to a germ that got you the flu. But why was your immune system weakened? Why were you exposed to the germ? Maybe it's a social circumstance. And so that's more fundamental or upstream. So I think the important point here is that when we talk about the causes of disease, all these perspectives are valid. The question is, where do we want to focus? So when they're all valid, where do we want to focus for the most action, for the most potential impact in an IRL framework sort of way? You probably know that the history of epidemiology is driven around the 1820s through 1870s, where cholera, really a disease that causes horrible diarrhea to the point of death, was coming in waves, coming in epidemics. And so there was a big problem, particularly in London. And so people thought, gee, why is this happening? Why is this happening now in London? And many people thought it was God's will or sin. Others thought it was this idea of a miasma, to be simple, sort of a stink in the air, which is not a crazy idea that we could talk about another time. Others thought it was literally elevation. It turned out that people living at a higher elevation were less sick than people living at lower elevations. Why? Well, it turns out it's because people living on higher elevations were more wealthy. They had access to better food and water and so forth. People also thought about contagion, but really hadn't nailed it down yet. So contagion was something thought about, but there was no clear proof that contagion of various forms would be causing disease. So you might know that this handsome fellow named John Snow, who was a physician in the 1800s, was actually an anesthesiologist, always screw that up, an anesthesiologist who was interested in gas. And so the prevailing scientific theory, because the God theology stuff wasn't in the realm of science, the prevailing scientific theory was this miasma, this stink. But being interested in gas and human health, John Snow didn't believe that. So he began to think about and then prove that it wasn't miasma, that it was something in the water, something contagious. And some of you might have seen a map, something like this. This is a map of London, and I know the colors may not be perfect, but you can look sort of toward the top, and it looks like a highway, a bit sort of just white space there. It's actually the Thames River, and it's sort of winding through London. And then a greenish blue area and a reddish pink area. Those areas are areas covered by two different water companies. One water company taking the water upstream to be drunk, and the other water company downstream. And you'll notice sort of the top middle of the graph, those areas overlap. And so this was Snow's great insight. He realized that we had the same kind of people living in the same place, the same elevation, and the same housing. The only thing that was different was in one household they got water from upstream, the other household downstream. And so when cholera hit this area and people were getting the water downstream, were really the only ones getting sick, he said, it has to be something in downstream water, and he then began to theorize about the cholera bacteria. We know that to be true today. So in the 1850s, as a result of Snow and some others, germ theory came on the rise. Note that this is pre-Pasteur. No one had seen these critters yet, but they knew that they were there. So the story is that germs cause disease. That's one perspective. Think about it, though, this way, and this comes from one of my favorite authors, Chris Hamlin, a historian, and he talks about this. He says, not surprisingly, in the 1850s, the focus became on disease and cases, not disease, agentic or actionable people, and social institutions. The cause of the cause was not entertained, which is to say, why were people not thinking that the problem was, yes, in the water downstream, but why was the water downstream more polluted than the water upstream? What was the institution, the social framework? Hamlin goes on, a political medicine, a medicine entertaining political and struggle and conflict, with the status of economics, failed to develop. Public health, along with medicine more generally, achieved autonomy. They got to be on their own. Yet it did so by sacrificing the claim to speak with authority on many social issues. So what matters here is the story of germ theory is true, but it's also true that it's also a story of corporate malfeasance, if you will. The water company taking water downstream that was making people sick was illegally taking water downstream. The law of the day was only clean water upstream. So yes, it's true germs caused it, but the cause of cause, if you will, was corporate malfeasance. So the point, and we struggle with this today, epidemiology in particular, I'd say most of health research, uncritical adoption of the Snow myth, and the resultant germ theory forecloses alternative explanations, explanations about social forces, corporate malfeasance, power, greed, and so forth. Now, to be clear, in 1854, if you're trying not to get sick, you do want to know about germs in water so you can begin to not drink that stuff and, of course, wash your hands, and on we go thereafter. So I don't want to make it the case that germs don't matter, just that it's only one of potentially many stories we can tell. And when you and I and the IRL family begin to present our research, we want to keep these multiple perspectives in mind and think about what's the most useful perspective to achieve the action you and I seek.